all, good afternoon and welcome. Thank you all for being here for this seminar. And let me begin by saying that this is the final seminar in this fourth I-LanD series, which the University of Salerno has proudly hosted this year. So I'm therefore both pleased and honored to be the one to bring this cycle to a close. And I want to thank Syria Aguzzo for the opportunity to host one of these thought-provoking seminars. And I am confident that also this one will provide valuable insights and intellectual stimulus to students, fellow academics, early career scorers, and all those who are currently engaged with or may in the future take an interest in the field of critical discourse analysis. In fact, this final panel is titled Rethinking CDA in Peripheral Domains, Challenges and Opportunities, and is a sort of invitation to consider how critical discourse analysis can be applied to non-traditional or so-called peripheral discursive fields. And the motivation behind this topic comes from the awareness that much has already been said and deeply explored within the more traditional areas of CDA, particularly regarding power dynamics in institutional discourse, mostly within the frameworks of Fairclough, Wodak, and Van Dyck. Yet, contemporary communicative landscapes invite us to rethink the boundaries of what constitutes a legitimate object of critical inquiry. Various discursive sites, such as music, workplace communication, or entertainment, AI-generated language, and environmental activism, to name just a few, may lie outside CDA's traditional focus, but they are no less implicated in the negotiation of ideology and power. At the same time, they offer fertile ground for maintaining and reinterpreting CDA's critical and emancipatory foundations. So, in short, our question and the aim of this seminar is to answer to this question. What happens when CDA turns its gaze away from its classical targets, so government and the media, and looks instead at everyday micro-level practices? So this shift in focus invites us to move beyond our familiar boundaries and to rethink what truly counts as critical inquiry, to revisit the meaning and the value that we attach to the very idea of power. It is precisely at this crossroads that today's guests offer their precious contribution. They bring with them a wealth of experience, research perspectives, and critical insights that I'm sure will help us broaden our analytical horizons in the true spirit of the I-LanD Seminar Series. That is, a space for open conversation where ideas and perspectives can circulate freely and become opportunities for mutual learning and cross-fertilization of thought. So I warmly invite you all to take an active part in the final session of the panel. After the presentations and a short discussion among the panelists, we'll open the floor to questions, observations, comments from the audience. But before we move on to our invited guest speakers, who, as in the previous seminars of the series, will each give a focused 10-minute presentation without any visual aids or slides, I need to make a brief disclaimer because there has been a slight change to the original schedule. Massimiliano De Mata will not be joining us due to unforeseen commitments. However, this has given us the opportunity to welcome Paola Attolino, whom I warmly thank for her enthusiastic availability, and she will be the first to speak, although unfortunately she won't be able to stay for the entire duration of the seminar. I would also like to thank all the other guests, Paolo Donadio, Margaret Rasulo, and Bronwen Hughes. It is both a privilege and a pleasure to introduce you all. So I would start by introducing Paola Attolino, who is Associate Professor of English Language and Linguistics at the University of Salerno, where she teaches courses in political science, international relations, and sports and social well-being management. Her recent research investigates the complex intersections between language, media, and society, with particular emphasis on political discourse and contrastive phraseology. She has long explored the relationship between rap music and politics, examining the politics of language as embedded in the politics of race. Paolo Donadio, instead, holds a PhD in English language for special purposes and works as an associate professor of English linguistics at the University Federico II in Naples. His main research interests lie in political discourse analysis. His is the volume Il partito globale, la nuova lingua del neolaburismo britannico, specialized discourse, language and identity. His is the volume Uno come te, europei e nuovi europei nei percorsi di integrazione, and translation studies. Bronwen Hughes is Associate Professor of English Language and Translation at the University Parthenope. Her research interests lie in the field of cross-cultural media studies, specifically format studies and audiovisual translation. Besides the field of migration studies, in which she has published a volume titled And This Is My Story, her recent research has focused on prejudice against marginalized groups, especially across the field of social media. As a founding member of the transition project carried out in collaboration with the Oxford University Department of Education, she's also currently investigating English medium instruction classroom practices at the tertiary level. Last but not least, Margaret Rasulo is Associate Professor of English Language and Translation at the University of Campania Luigi Vanvitelli. Her scholarly work is grounded in the field of critical discourse studies, with a particular focus on multimodal CDA, an area through which she explores the linguistic and discursive mechanism underpinning social phenomena such as hate speech, conspiracy narratives, media bias, and radicalization discourses, especially within the broader context of societal transformation and digital communication. She has published extensively on issues related to climate change discourse, political rhetorics, and gender discrimination, examining how these texts contribute to shaping public opinion and ideological position. So, I would say that without further ado, we can start our panel. And I am delighted to give the floor to our first speaker, Paola Attolino. Today's contribution is CDA, Alternate History and Mockumentaries, the Deanverse Case, and it focuses on the application of CDA to the Monumentum Mythos, a YouTube mockumentary that imagines an alternate history where James Dean becomes US president. By examining how the mockumentary both reproduces and subverts patterns of political discourse, the talk shows how alternate history becomes a space for reflecting on American identity, power, and the politics of memory in contemporary culture. So given these premises, we are eager to hear the rest from you, Paola, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. And thank you, Mikaela, first of all, for inviting me. It's really a pleasure to be here. And right the day after such a special occasion, the 10th birthday of I-LanD. And it's really nice also to see so many familiar faces, or at least names, even online. And before I start, as you anticipated, just a quick note. Unfortunately, I won't be able to stay until the end of the seminar, and I have to go right after my talk, as I have another commitment that I can't avoid. So unfortunately, I will miss the final debate, and I'm really very sorry for this. But I really wanted to be here today to share with you something that has become a new passion of mine. That's to say, alternate history. Now, I'm sure many of you are already familiar with the genre, a branch of speculative fiction that imagines worlds where history takes a different turn. This moment is triggered by a simple but very powerful question. What if? For example, what if the Roman Empire had never fallen? Or what if Hitler had won the Second World War? Or what if James Dean had survived his 1955 car crash? And that's exactly the question that started my research. A few months ago, I was reading a call for papers on alternate history from the journal Contact Zone. And the first thing that popped into my mind was, what if James Dean hadn't died? Recalling my old passion for the iconic actor. Alas, pretty old, as it dates back to when I was a teenager. And I have the proof. This is my mouse pad with Jimmy. And so I did what any curious fan would do. So I Googled the question, and that's how I discovered a YouTube documentary called The Monument Mythos, created by Alex Casanas between 2020 and 2022. In this alternate universe, set in a Cold War climate, James Dean survives his car crash and becomes 37th President of the United States, replacing Richard Nixon. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, we have President James Dean. And so I decided to analyze the 2 episodes of the mockumentary featuring the fictional President Dean using a multimodal CDA approach as proposed by Kress in 2012. This means not just, of course, studying the verbal test, but also how images, sounds, editing, and typographical work together to create meaning. And this approach is appropriate for a mockumentary like the Monument Mythos because it constantly blurs the line between fact and fiction, much like misinformation does. I was intrigued by the fact that both mockumentary and misinformation rely on the fact that something fake feels real, giving us the illusion of authenticity. In other words, alternate history and misinformation share the same linguistic DNA. And now the 2 episodes I focused on are called Dean Democracy and Dean Disaster. Catchy titles that already play with the sound and rhythm with the repetition of the D sound. In Dean Democracy, we watch a reimagined 1968 presidential campaign with James Dean announcing his candidacy with the slogan, "What are we waiting for? Let's bring them back home." Them, of course, are the American soldiers in Vietnam. And this simple slogan is combined with war images and upbeat jazz music, which is a perfect recipe for propaganda. And through the lens of CDA, we can see how rhythm, repetition, and multimodal cohesion build a persuasive effect appealing to emotion rather than reason. In another scene, Dean's campaign replaces traditional political debates with, guess what? Car races. Yes, car races between Dean and Nixon. So politics becomes performance, literally action as discourse. And it's a playful but sharp critique of the verbosity of conventional politics. And then the tone changes completely. In episode Dean Disaster, we enter dystopia. A terrorist group hijacks national sirens, spreading chaos across the country, and President Dean addresses the nation saying, "It's Jimmy speaking, we'll make things right." So the use of Jimmy instead of James sounds friendly, almost intimate, and the we creates a sense of unity against a faithless enemy, the so-called anti or anti-Dean association. Now, from a CDA perspective, this is a typical example of us versus them rhetoric, the same structure that we find in populist and authoritarian discourse. But here's the twist. While traditional Cold War narratives saw the threat as external, let's say the Soviet Union, the Dean verse relocates the danger inward, reflecting the post-9/11 security discourse, where the enemy is domestic, invisible, omnipresent. At this point, CDA meets cultural memory, which is not just about what societies remember, but why and how they remember. By looking at how James Dean's fictional presidency is constructed linguistically, visually, and ideologically, we see that alternate history becomes much more than fantasy. It becomes a tool for critical thinking. It invites us to reflect on what is remembered and why and how we remember, what is forgotten, and how collective identity is shaped through narrative. James Dean's presidential image, for example, evokes John Kennedy, who remains a key site of memory in American culture and society. So the Dean verse is not just a what-if game. It is a mirror. reflecting how narratives, even fictional ones, shape our sense of truth, our commitment, and also democracy. Alternate history challenges dominant version of the past and at the same time invites us to critically assess the present. As Fairclough reminds us, interpretation always depends on what he calls members' resources, our background knowledge, experiences, linguistic and ideological frameworks. We all read the same text, but we don't all interpret it in the same way. And the risk of analytical bias and subjective interpretation is an issue often associated with CDA. But I think that alternate history supported by CDA becomes a powerful educational tool. And so by inviting students to create their own counterfactual narratives, like I do, even with a competent and conscious use of AI tools, we can help them question framing, recognize manipulation, and develop critical thinking. And so rephrasing a 1987 song where Sting, and so I also pay homage to our lead host, sings, "History will teach us nothing," maybe alternate history can teach us something. And with this, I thank you for the attention. Maybe I stay less than 10 minutes, I'm not sure, because I'm in a rush, so.
Okay. Can you hear me? Yeah, okay.
Yes.
So thank you, Paola. It was very stimulating. Thanks for the present you gave me. Some of the points raised are particularly worthy of further discussion. So unfortunately, you won't be here for the discussion later on. But anyway, I will make sure to relay any questions or issues that may come up. Okay, thanks again.
Okay,
And now,
thank you.
Thank you. And
Thank
now,
you.
instead, let's move on to our next speaker. I'm really pleased to introduce Paolo Donadio, a colleague who is particularly special to me, as many years ago we shared the initial stages of a meaningful journey of research and experimentation. So today he is going to talk about the evolution of environmental discourse in politics. Starting by focusing on British politics, he will analyze party manifestos from 1945 to 2024, which are his primary reference corpus at the moment. And through a critical discourse approach, mainly inspired by Wodak's model and integrated by Rom Harre's Greenspeak, the project is meant to explore how parties have framed and developed ecological concerns over time. So, Paolo, it's your turn to kick things off. Then the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mikaela. And can you hear me?
Yeah.
All right. So I just, first of all, thank you and thanks to CDA and to all the others who actually have worked for these seminars. And I would like to start with a very simple question that I sometimes think about, but actually was inspired by your introduction. So we always tend to think that some ideas or concepts are taken for granted, such as political discourse. And this thing is actually becoming quite weird to question today, because actually political discourse can be everything. And I'm thinking that rather than political discourse, we should talk or think about political themes, political topics that can actually have a private or a public, how can I say, effect or result. The idea that everything can be called as political discourse or nothing is political discourse is quite is becoming, I don't know, it's something that I'm really thinking about, because I find that even private stories can sometimes are intrinsically political, and even these split between private and public private lives and public intentions, private intentions and private life. So these actually distinction, these type of difference is becoming quite difficult to grasp or difficult to understand. So my point is is quite simple. I'm trying to expand right the range of my interest, and one of my interest is environment and climate change. And as I already did in other papers, I'm trying to connect, to combine, to intertwine different CDA approaches and inputs that come from other disciplines, right? So today, probably you're already quite familiar with these type of approaches, but today I'd like to present these type of interaction between social psychology and the concept of positioning and the environmental discourse. All right, environmental discourse is something that is quite closely related to time, right? So environmental discourses, especially as we intended today, is a type of talk, a type of representation, framing that connects the past, narrates special type of past through something that is uh, uh, current and implies agency, right? Agency today with some visions about the future. So environmentalism is always closely connected to time, and these, of course, um, made me think that probably among the different approaches, the best one was the one that was more um, directed to pay attention to history, right? What we call the discourse historical approach, the Vodak's approach. Vodak's approach actually is something that uh, is not immediately concerned with looking for hidden ideologies or power and subordination, but tries to reconstruct uh, relationships between agents by placing these relations into a context, into a historical context. And this, of course, is quite difficult. This is, of course, always quite difficult. Um, I'm trying to connect this discourse historical approach with positioning theory, because environmental discourse uh, is probably something that we take for granted today. So climate change, global warming, greenhouse gases, and so on. But if we read papers, I'm focusing on British politics, on British politics, but I'll try to expand these perspectives on other countries. If we read papers, documents, political documents, manifestos, this is just an example. This is just my starting point. Manifestos from the 40s, from the 50s, we find nothing. We find nothing except for a quite vague or quite um, I don't know, not really implicit reference to the protection of the environment, especially. And we find that these type of young or environmentalism is especially shared in right-wing parties, right, rather than liberal or left-wing parties, left-wing coalitions or areas. So positioning, some words about positioning. Positioning is a theory, is a social psychology theory, and actually is about the dynamic assignment of roles, responsibilities, tasks, duties uh, that are uh, uh, negotiated and reassigned, assigned, and reconstructed during interaction, during any type of communicative interaction. So in conversation, especially in conversations. So this is the main focus of Harry and Van Langenhove. So this is a theory that was developed in the 90s, right, not so long ago. But of course, we can use positioning theory and this dynamic assignment of identities even in today's political discourse, right? And this was quite fascinating for me. Quite was a kind of door that I always like these sort of multidisciplinary contacts, especially with cognitive psychology and cognitive linguistics. Of course, this is a boundary that really does not exist, and in a sense, probably Van Dyck has been the most representative CDA scholar that has tried to break this boundary between cognitive and cognitive perspectives and discourse analysis and critical discourse analysis and the analysis of ideologies. So the application of positioning theory is actually always um, uh, grounded and focused on language use and reveals, in my case, the way in which political parties, I'm focusing on political parties, but just for sake of brevity, just to start, all right, just to start thinking about these type of issues, but actually this type of positioning is allows me to understand the way in which identities are constructed. So identities, and so not fixed and established identities, but identities are negotiated. And the fact is that these identities can change over time. So these identities, for example, there is not an environmental identity for Labour Party until the 60s, right? Until some particular events that took place in London, especially in London, at the end of the 50s and in the 60s, and then of course the 70s actually are the moment in which there's a quite clear and remarkable uh, change, right, of thinking. As a sort of a turning point in this environmental awareness. Of course, this theory is, I think, quite useful and quite easy to combine with the with the CDA approaches, especially the discourse historical approach. Um, Again, because both uh, both type of investigation perspectives are concerned with time, right? Are concerned with time, and the funny thing is that Harre and other scholars and other colleagues tried in 1991 to apply the positioning theory to green speak. Right, there's a quite well-known book that is called Green Speak, published in 1999, and this was quite, I think it was quite important, quite groundbreaking, at least for me, because insisted on the fact that the environmental discourse is a teleological one. Teleological because actually is something that is always projected onto a future, but onto a future by representing the past. In this sort of interplay between the past and the future, narrating the past, constructing the future, these identities change. These identities change, and it is, I think, a bit pretentious to look for these identities, especially when they are back in the past, right? So, for example, I followed very carefully Paola's presentation, and I was thinking what if this mockumentary is watched by a guy who's never, a boy, a young teenager who's never known Nixon or James Dean, right? So this is our perspective is the perspective of the ones who have this type of background. But of course, sometimes I mention people and facts during my classes, and my students don't know what I'm talking about. So this is mockumentaries, actually historical reconstructions that can be puzzling in some cases and can be quite embarrassing, because this is they mark a difference between boomers and non-boomers. So the project is meant to investigate this type of framing, the way in which UK major parties actually have framed ecological concerns through discourse, of course, and the way in which, especially the way in which they have created what RA calls scenarios or script, right? That have a narrative, background, that are actually made up of an agent, usually the political party, a rival, an opponent, and the beneficiaries, the citizens, right? So in these sort of interaction, which is split into 3 or sometimes even 4 parts, because sometimes there are also the stakeholders such as the 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 the, the industries that are more directly involved in environment and environmental issues. In this sort of interaction, the identities change, and I've seen, just by reading the manifestos from the 1945, from the end of the Second War, of the Second World War to 2024, basically, I've seen that these identities change, right? And for example, what I know about the Green Party, the UK Green Party, is the fact that today they have 4 members of the parliament, right, elected last year. And this was, of course, a turning point, because it showed the need for a quite strong electoral mandate for this type of party, the Green Party, the UK Green Party. The UK Green Party actually managed to get 1 seat in 2010, but today there are 4 in the House of Commons. And this is of course the end of the story. My aim is to look for identities by focusing on keywords, naming, narrative roles, metaphors, the way in which each party has constructed its own and identities, and rivals and beneficiaries' identities in different ways, and changing over time. So this is going to be my focus, and the results are actually quite surprising, because I always thought that the left, right, was cared for environment in a different way, all right, in contrast, in comparison to what we usually think, but it is not true. Actually, this environmental awareness and need, all right, to protect the environment was much more felt among right-wing parties and conservative areas, rather than on the other side. And then the Liberal Party, probably the third, was the one that more clearly, right, started the debate on environment, and obliged the other parties, because this is another thing. So the intertextuality is something that needs to be taken into account when you read past papers, when you read past documents, right? So sometimes quite difficult to reconstruct. But actually, this was something that happened in the 60s, and especially in the early 70s. And today, of course, is is quite clearly framed in scientific terms, with a scientific jargon that we have, that today we are all familiar with, but that actually was generated in the early 70s, and thanks to some political activists, political environmental activists of that time. So that's all for now. I don't want to be too.
Okay, thank you, Paolo. I've taken some notes, so we will have time to comment on these points
Yes, thank you very much.
in a while. But now let's move on to our next speakers, Bronwen, Hughes and Margaret Rasulo, who are one next to the other. They are going to give a joint talk, as you can imagine from the position on screen. The title is Ethics, Authenticity and the Politics of Amplification. And the talk proposes a recalibrated ethics of CDA for post-truth, attention-driven platforms, asking not only who has the power, but also what can we build with those concerned to let them speak and be heard more safely tomorrow. So we're all ears and very much looking forward to hearing from you. Who will speak first?
I'm the first one.
Okay, so Bronwen or Bonnie. Okay,
We go in alphabetical order.
No, this British imperialism period.
It's the British imperialism, as she rightly said. So first of all, thanks for having us. Thank you, Mikaela. Thanks to Syria. Thanks to Pasquale and any other members of the team who we haven't actually dealt with. And we're delighted to be here. And our aim in our brief talk today is to investigate why, in the world that we all inhabit, there's a need, in fact, to go beyond seminal or foundational CDA and adapt its methodological framework to the discursive practices that circulate within a platformed architecture, which tends to curate, to amplify, and sadly, very often to weaponize talk in real time. So the analytical or investigative move towards this change is in the object of the analytical forces, brings about a change in our research rationale. So what we believe is that it's no longer enough to merely describe discourse. We in fact have to think about how it circulates and also how to intervene in it. So in our talk, we're going to be shifting from the classical foundations of CDA or seminal foundations of CDA to the pressures that are exerted by today's environment, making a case through the case studies that we will be presenting later on for a more intervention-oriented, community-engaged form of CDA. And we'll do this by illustrating these 3 case studies, and hopefully we'll conclude by arguing that such a reorientation, in fact, also calls for a new form of ethics and a new take on authenticity. So let's start with foundational seminal CDA as we call it. Obviously, we're harking back to Fairclough, Vodak, Van Dyck, and others, talking about the mid-80s, beginning of the 80s. And as we're all aware, foundational CDA treats language as social practice and insists that discourse is in fact never innocent. What we say and how we say it encodes power relations, reproduces or resists forms of ideology, and manages inequality and legitimizes, to a certain extent, hegemonic forms. So CDA has always taught us as scholars to ask in every single context, who can say what to whom, under what conditions, and with what form of social consequences. And for us, that legacy is non-negotiable. We're going to keep that. The problem is that the terrain in which discourse now circulates has changed completely. So we're no longer only dealing with texts in the traditional way, as we used to do way at the beginning. Most of us, at least, used to study parliamentary debates or policy documents or interviews or press articles, news articles. What we're now dealing with, obviously, is platformed discourse. That's to say, discourse that's actively shaped by the technical environments in which it appears. So we have formats like, we're all familiar with stitches and duets, or pinned comments, or ranking systems, or dwell times, watch times, algorithmic boosts. And all of these are never to be considered neutral containers because they are in themselves meaning-making sources. So basically what we're saying is that the object of analysis is way more ambitious today. And we can name 3 parts, more or less. First, we've got the text, which we've always dealt with. That's to say the linguistic and semiotic material, which we still analyze very closely. Then we have the technologies. That's to say the affordances that are going to shape delivery, that are going to shape uptake. And finally, in third position, not in a ranking system, we have the trajectories. That's to say the paths that discourse actually takes. Who's going to pick it up? Who's going to amplify it? How it's going to be re-edited, recontextualized, or, as I previously mentioned, weaponized over time. So basically, we analyze not just what is said, but what is made sayable, what is made shareable, and via which medium. Sorry, that's a harking back to McLuhan there. As this often outweighs the actual context and determines what is meant and how it affects us. So the real shift is not only methodological, it's functional, it's conceptual. It's about what we think CDA is actually for. So more and more, this is us, we see CDA not only as a way of analyzing discourse, but as something that is meant to act out there in the world. If you think about it, we used to think of going online as something that we did. We used to log on to find our friends, or to join a cause, or to check in with long-lost family members. But now, if you again think about it, to an ever greater extent, it's something that is done to us. So it's the platform that now decides who we see, who we meet, what gets amplified, and our agency, in fact, gets quietly traded for what the algorithm offers. And this is where we want to introduce the concept of community-engaged activism. And by that, we mean a way of working where analysis and action belong together, rather than being staged as separate phases, different phases. So we still carry out detailed discourse work, of course we do. That part is never going to go away. But we don't just document harm. We alert participatory publics and make, or try to make, certain forms of damage less likely to recur in this platformed world. So in other words, what we're saying here is that we want a CDA that evolves with the times, that circulates outside the academy, outside that ivory tower, and that has an impact on real settings. Put simply, what we are looking for is a CDA that travels. And to make that move, it helps in a certain sense to bring in G's distinction, which we're all familiar with, between small d discourse and capital D discourse. As you well remember, capital D discourses are those large social narratives about gender, masculinity, class, race, entitlement, credibility, so on. Whereas small d discourses is the situated, they concern the situated work. So we're talking about stance markers, we're talking about wording, we're talking the use of those platform affordances. And our claim that we're trying to make here is that today the most consequential discursive work often happens at that small d level. It's inherent to a topos of neighborhood, central to Kosravinik and Krisanovsky's work on social media critical discourse studies, whereby local incidents are framed and are upscaled via all those likes and shares, and then further amplified through those echo chambers and by those affective publics. So what we are what we are referring to as the activist turn in CDA is about recognizing those small local moves and using them to contribute and perhaps contest the larger discourses, or capital D discourses, that organize social life. And we're actually calling it an activist turn quite deliberately. As we all remember, over the last decades, we've lived through a considerable number of turns in discourse work. There was the narrative turn, there was the emotional turn, there was the multimodal turn. But the turn that we see emerging now is an activist one, in the sense of waving a red flag, rather than obviously actually being on the barricades. The question becomes for us, how do we get out of the ivory tower? How do we climb down from that ivory tower and into what might be referred to as a hearing environment, where lived experience is not only valid data, it doesn't only constitute valid data, but it becomes audible, it becomes answerable, and it becomes safer to express. So for us, basically, this activist turn is anchored in 5 key words that are empathy, solidarity, collaboration, ethics, and authenticity. Now, obviously, empathy, as we all know, refers to consentful listening. So in our research, which often concerns, or recently has concerned, discourses of pain, we refuse to treat people's disclosures as raw material. And we also make a stylistic commitment and try to use language that does not reharm those people. Solidarity, the second term in our list, means that we support survivors and victims, speaking with them rather than for them. Collaboration obviously refers to sharing the ownership of what goes out there into the world. And as for ethics, which is a key term, and we'll be coming back to later, we consider it a form of guardrail that actually makes those first 4 sustainable. But we'll return to ethics later, as I said, because for us, it is part of the core argument that CDA has to move beyond its foundational or seminal form. But before we go there, we want to ground this in some form of practice. So we'll briefly walk you through 3 of our recent case studies. I'm afraid all of them concern discourses of pain. So the first one is incest narratives. We've worked on incest narratives. The second one is bad love. That's violent relationships. And the third one is the Karen genre. We want to do this because we want to show how this way of thinking actually moves from analysis to intervention. The first case is our work on incest narratives. So we, in this case, very briefly, we analyzed 40 elicited narratives from an Australian podcast in which victim survivors wrote accounts of incest, and those accounts were then voiced by famous people, so actors, singers, sports people, etc. And the casting choice really, really mattered because it framed this disclosure of the incest victims, not as a form of pathology or a form of shame, but as something that really deserved public hearing and social recognition. And throughout that particular study, we also made a linguistic decision that we'd like to consider an activist decision. That's to say, we used the word incest throughout our research. We did not adopt the medicalized euphemism intrafamilial child sexual abuse, which today, much like many other bureaucratic terms or medical terms, just think of the term obese, in other domains, drains the violation completely of its force and turns it into some kind of technical category. By naming incest directly is a way of returning agency to the speakers. And it refuses that erasure by terminology that so often protects perpetrators and isolates the survivors or the victims. Across the dataset, a recognizable discourse of incest progressively emerged, showcasing the victim's strong determination to stop hiding in plain sight. That was the name of our research project. The refusal to carry blame that I mentioned previously, and a movement towards speaking out even after having been dismissed repeatedly. In other words, both harm and agency were present. Now, if we stop there, we would in fact still be doing CDA in the seminal sense, describing how taboo experience is narrated, how positions are constructed. But we didn't actually stop there. We asked ourselves instead, what can this analysis be turned into that actually empowers the victims to become the agents of their own social redemption? Redemption, pardon the term. So we thought that our findings could also serve to build more concrete awareness-raising tools. An idea in this case could be, there are many others, but one idea could be a survivor-centered language guide for institutional stakeholders. So as you see, this is taking the activist turn. This is going beyond. So a language guide that could focus on how to, for example, phrase the questions, on which terms should be avoided because they euphemize, and on why explicit naming of these victim survivors actually matters. I'm handing over to Maggie.
Right. It's my turn now. So our investigation of CDA and beyond also draws on our second case study, which deals with seemingly loving exchanges that are shared across Reddit, which we all know is a social media forum-like network. Now, these relationships are obviously controlling, coercive, or even emotionally violent, but they're presented as caring. And that's why we call this study Bad Love. Now, what stands out here is how control is linguistically laundered as affection. In expressions such as, I only did that because I love you, or if you loved me, you would do this or that. And I love you, but where is it? Sorry. I lost the page.
She can't. There you go.
Okay, here it is. I love you, but I'm doing this for your own good. So underneath these statements lie very small, yet very powerful linguistic levers that reveal a license for surveillance. That is, a demand for compliance and a way of somehow softening control. So it sounds like care, actually. Now, again, with a view to a more proactive critical approach, as Bonnie described earlier, we asked ourselves whether there could be any other form of tangible outcome to this study. And for example, some awareness-raising tools that explore the use of certain linguistic formulae often encountered in amorous relationships or familiar relationships could be developed in order to facilitate what we call that trained listening of love phraseology in this case, and discern whether or not it actually stands for coercive discourse or not. So this and other similar tools have a very important function. They can reopen agency for the person on the receiving end of such interactions. So because the whole point of our talk today is to show how CDA analysis can effectively move from description to practical harm-reducing action in different settings, we then applied the same exact analysis to intervention logic to a very different and highly visible phenomenon, which the so-called Karen clips. I'm sure we've all had close encounters with a Karen in our lives, right? A Karen is a typically white, female, and middle-class figure who publicly likes to police the behavior and the space that belongs to others, often invoking rules or personal authority. Now, Karen reels are short videos, as reels usually are, that capture and circulate confrontational moments and turning them into a repeatable online genre of its own. So our aim in this case was to illustrate that once everyday interaction is staged inside a TikTok reel architecture, it stops being just everyday interaction because it's the platform itself that invites filming, captioning, stitching, duetting, rapid circulation, and even what begins as a banal, mildly funny or awkward encounter is automatically turned into a repeatable template, which unfortunately can be picked up, reenacted, and intensified by others. And it is this intensification where the real risk lies. So over time, this can normalize a particular way of talking to or talking about certain kinds of people, and they're usually gendered or racialized and classed. So the more these confrontational exchanges are reproduced for entertainment, the easier it becomes for them to seep into discriminatory discourse, which includes bias, negative stereotyping, and in some cases, speech that clearly aligns with hate speech practices. So our point is that the platform affordances make the pattern legible and shareable, and that legibility encourages emulation and certainly not reflection. So we're careful, though, not to say that Karenness or other forms of what we call confrontational backtalk, right, automatically qualify as hate speech, because sometimes they do have protected categories which are targeted, but other times not. But the escalation script that we identified in our research is both very discernible and quite distinctive. So what happens? People watch these clips, they absorb the template, and then they go on to reproduce it elsewhere. So again, we asked, is there any way this critical activist approach could provide some practical guidance? So what we thought of was to combat such confrontational practices, students or other stakeholders, educators, authorities might view original Karen-style clips and first contextualize them by identifying the trigger points where entitlement can escalate to other layers of offensive speech, dangerous speech. Then they can script a brief bystander intervention, which could serve to play down that aggressive nature of the dialogue. And subsequently, students or others could record a short reel replaying the scene with the improved sequence. Now, the final reel or other product could become a peer-produced awareness tool, illustrating how everyday platform conflict can be countered and diffused. Now, at this point, a pattern should be emerging. For each of the 3 case studies that we presented, we have identified a recurring discursive mechanism brought to the fore through CDA, obviously, and the full toolkit of approaches it affords. Now, we need to pay special attention on the activist turn in CDA that we have described so far, which progressively made us aware that we needed to view ethics in a new way, as Bonnie said at the very beginning of this presentation. So in a platformed AI-mediated environment, we need to reckon with live and oftentimes staged interventions such as the Karen clips. And this makes today's ethical questions even sharper, owing to the responsibility that they place upon amplification. So the questions, for example, are, to what extent can we reopen trauma? Or make someone more visible or vulnerable to the wrong audience, or take a local disclosure and amplify it into a hostile arena it was never meant to reach. Yet the moment we disseminate the rationale behind our research and the ensuing fit-to-purpose tools that we just described based on our activist approach to CDA, we believe we are altering the communicative, or we can alter the communicative ecology of network publics. And with this comes a form of obligation, which sits underneath all three cases. And obligation is strongly linked to two other key terms: authenticity and truth in platform discourse. In older institutional contexts, we were often allowed, more or less, to assume authenticity. So a government white paper, a parliamentary speech, a corporate mission statement, even mass media messages, each presented itself as an official or affiliated or partisan position and could be treated as such. In today's platform discourse, however, authenticity is both performed and expected. So prosumers go out of their way to depict themselves as real, as raw, as unfiltered, while audiences are trained with contraptions such as likes, emojis, and whatnot to reward performances of truth, even when those performances are partially staged. So you see, it's a different economy of truth. In some spaces, like dating platforms, for example, a certain bending of the truth is expected and even functional. In survivor forums, as the incest forums, the whole point is truth as testimony, because a disclosure there is a form of catharsis. And the reward is indeed recognition and solidarity. And still in other spaces like the Karen reels, truth is mobilized as evidence. So what what they're saying is, this is what entitlement looks like. This is what racism looks like. And this is what harassment looks like. Even if they're staged, they are representative. So in what we now refer to as the attention economy, in the end, authenticity is working across at least three different modes at once. The testimony mode, or this is my story, listen. The leverage mode, this is proof, share it. And the currency mode, this is my authentic self, follow me. So if CDA is going to move beyond, it has to learn to distinguish among these and many other modes, and to attach different ethical responsibilities to each, and subsequently devise appropriate tools, like we have done, that counter the phenomenon and raise awareness of its exposure. The disclosure of an incest victim that seeks care cannot be investigated, researched, explored in the same way as a Karen outrage clip that seeks mobilization, or a narrative that seeks visibility. And Bonnie's going to wrap it up for us.
Here we go. I'm never too sure if talking about the case studies takes us away from the more abstract part of our talk. But basically, to close, what we are arguing under the heading going beyond CDA is not that we are abandoning any form of critique in favor of what you could call feel-good activism. And it's not that we imagine we can fix forms of structural injustice like the ones that we've described with a few lesson plans or questionnaires or guidelines or things like that. What we're trying to say is that CDA's commitments to power, to ideology, to inequality, to agency are now operating in a completely different world. It's a platformed post-truth environment where discourse has been accelerated considerably, it's been weaponized, and it's been monetized in real time. And in this environment, we need to give back tools that are going to help people to speak, to be heard, and also to stay safer. So whereas foundational or seminal CDA asked questions such as, who has power here? And how does the language actually sustain those forms of power? The question that perhaps we're trying to add today, now in our brief talk, is what can we actually build with the people concerned that will let them speak and be heard more safely tomorrow and in the future? Thanks very much.
Thank you,
Both here
thank
now.
you, thank you so much. Okay, did you close the microphone? Yeah, okay. So much food for thought. Really, I've taken down lots of notes. I hope to remember all of the things that I've thought about when you all were talking. But I think that now the first step is to begin the discussion among you. So I wonder if you have any comments or questions you would like to address one to one another, since all your talks had a common line. And I'm really happy that all of the talks perfectly fit the macro topic of the seminar. So we are all focused on how we can still use CDA, but in different ways, with different aims and better aims, I hope. But anyway, I leave questions and comments to you, if you have any, of course.
Yes, of course, there are many.
Paolo starting, because I have one quick one for Paolo, but I think
yes, I was very
Paolo's
much
starting.
I was very much interested in your talk, and so many actually, so many things, so many things to think about and to ask you. I agree with you that today's circulation, as you mentioned, as you said, is a completely different world. It's a completely different world. So I don't know what this kind of circulation implies, but for sure it's it's a different speed. It's a different type of attention. I wouldn't place so much emphasis on the channels, because channels, yes, are important. So we can mention platforms, podcasts, and so on. But what really changes is the fact that there is not so much in common, right, among people, because everyone, and I see it with my daughters, everyone has its own way of understanding and learning what the real world is or is not. And sometimes, even if you belong to the same generation, to the same age, you use the same type of instruments, tools, and social networks, and so on. I think that we have the impression that we share so much. We don't share, actually. I don't want to say we share nothing, but our impression is that we don't share what we think, right? We share, but we don't know who's going to read our thoughts, who's going to read our text, and who's going to read. So this is the result of an exploding communication, an exploding word of communication. So the famous hypertextual word is a word in which everybody has its own path, everybody has its own ethics, everybody has its own, and so sometimes I see people debating even the I don't know, some quite basic definitions. You were talking about hate speech or incest in a way or another, using an explicit or not language. But sometimes of course, this is something that I really hate myself, but I see people debating and questioning, how do you define hate speech? What is hate according to you? What is this really incest? pedophiles. So pedophile, this is an example of pedophile. So I see things that are so far from my way of thinking that I'm really impressed and shocked sometimes. So this is my first question. The word, the circulation of talk is being so different, is so different today that it's quite difficult to make sense of it, right? And I don't know whether I wouldn't be able to do that, right? I think I wouldn't be able to do that. It's too difficult for me. It's too difficult for me. It's too difficult to pull the threads and make sense of all these means today. Second question is about activism. All right. How do we get out of our ivory tower? Well, I think that the fact that this is my impression, but I don't know if this can be shared. The fact that we deal with these type of issues is our activism. The fact that we do not explore the I don't know, the emergence of the will form rather than the auxiliaries. This is our form of. We do not actually work on let's say theoretical linguistics, but we work on our work are actually belong to the applied linguistics area. So the fact that we do this is our activism. So think about Chomsky. Chomsky is a linguist, political commentator, probably known for today, better known for his comments rather than for his language studies today, not 30 years ago. And what's the relationship between his idea about language and the way he is being able to intervene and orient the public debate. I think that as far as I'm concerned, the fact that I is my form of activism, then I go to rallies, I talk about things. If I'm given the possibility to leave an interview, I'm very happy. But sometimes this type of activism is not related to what I do.
Okay. Maybe pick up from the second one and then move back to the first, hoping that our memories will allow us to do that. Because, sorry.
I was just thinking aloud. I was thinking aloud. I didn't ask a question. I was thinking aloud. So I was not.
Sure.
So I was probably.
He has already forgotten.
Yes.
And I was waiting for the question to come.
No, but there is not a real question. So I don't think that this is not a conference. This is not a place for questions. This is probably a place for
confrontation.
Yes. And I was actually thinking aloud. So thinking and speaking at the same time. So it's quite difficult.
No. I'll just say very, very quickly, we did try to explain what we meant by activism when we used, erroneously or not, but we made a parallel with big capital D and small d discourse, in the sense that it would seem, because of the platformed environment, that there is actually a progressive move from the global to the local. And there's a need to look more closely at small d discourse, at small cases. I mentioned, I think in my part of the talk, I can't remember if it was Maggie or myself, we mentioned the topos of neighborhood, which is something that is emerging. I mean, we're not making any claims to this. Obviously, we've all done our reading and we all know what we're referring to. But there is this progressive move. I have a strange, because here it's not a conference and we can just I have a strange parallel in my mind, which you'll think that I'm going completely off the slate here. But I make a parallelism with what's happening in COP. If you look at the Conference of Parties at the moment, you're going to think that I'm going way beyond. But if you look at what is happening, for example, now in the Amazon with the concept of the mutiraus, and with the fact that global debates are no longer working. And so what they're trying to do is they're trying to bring the debate into a small, local way of dealing it. This isn't only happening with COP30. This happened way back in Turkey. It was the first. But there is a move from global to local slowly. Mags, what would you add to that? So what struck me in recent days is a parallelism with what is happening on the global scene in the COP discourse, for example. What would you add, Mags?
Not much more. It's that we're using small d discourse as a metaphor, obviously, okay, to conduct more humanizing research that is more manageable, that obviously will feed into the larger discourse, which are, in G's words, is capital discourse, so race and hate speech. So by approaching the platform, because obviously our context here for this talk is the platformed world. So maybe that wasn't, clear enough. We're moving in the platformed world where, as Paolo quite rightly said, it's very difficult to approach research by pulling all the threads together. It's quite confusing. Is what do you want to do first? What do you need to do first? How do we approach research in a platformed world? How do we approach reals? How do we recognize them? How do we recognize the linguistic evidence and whatnot? I mean, so we sort of adopted this small d, capital D, neighborhood, community-based research as a metaphor. Obviously, we're not going to go out in the community and act. Obviously, we're not activists, so we're not social workers, obviously, but what we like the idea of approaching small-scale research that could then feed into larger debates, such as climate or hate speech or whatever. So many other dimensions of discourse. That's all that's activism. You're quite right, Paolo. I mean, yes, you are being an activist because you're doing what you're doing, but for us, activism is exactly like yours, but we'd like to keep the research more manageable and then feed it into larger themes, larger dimensions. That's what we're thinking, because we're dealing with a platformed world. That is the key context. That's the context that we're moving in. So as you heard, the incests were podcasts. Bad Love on Reddit, and Karen is a TikTok reel. So that's what we're referring to. That's all.
Okay, if I can say something, I would like to start from a word that Paola used in a talk, that is politics performance or political performance. And I think that the main shift that you're all talking about is a shift from discourse to performance. So this determines a completely change of perspective when dealing with CDA, because we are not just analyzing discourse. Paolo mentioned the shift from discourse to topics and the effect of topics. So from discourse, we are moving on to other things. So topics, but especially performance. So Karen, but also when you, Paolo, mentioned the scenarios and the scripts, that's a performance as well that is described rather than a discourse.
Yes.
And I was really interested in the word that you used. You said agents and beneficiaries, and is this word coined by the author or by you? Because beneficiaries has a positive implication, connotation,
sure.
but it is not the perspective of CDA of considering the receivers as beneficiaries, no? Because we tend
this is of course a construction, right? This is a rhetorical construction, so it's not actually it's a representation of beneficiaries. So of course they probably are not. This is what is meant, but as Bonnie and Margaret were saying before, this is not true. This is simply not true. So this is something that is signified, that is represented, but is not inherently true, because this is part of the performance. The performance is something that is sometimes quite close to fiction, right? Quite close to fiction, and today you have this impression that you're living in a world that is a fictional one. It's not a real one, right? And you don't know whether this fiction is something that you do not understand because or not. Right.
You're right.
But
Hence our key words: authenticity,
Sure.
truth,
Yes.
ethics.
Yes.
What happens to these seminal concepts that have guided CDA, CDS, more generally throughout, all our academic life? What happens to them in a platformed world?
Yes.
Where offline and online, there's no distinction anymore. I think Carolyn Tagg said that at the AIA conference. We can't tell the difference between the online and offline like we used to.
You mentioned the word prosumer.
Yes, absolutely.
And that is the point. So there is so much confusion between the people who actively actually say something or passively get something. So
offer and demand, produce and consume. Everything is brought together. Absolutely.
Sure.
Okay, I think it's now time for the comments from the audience. So the floor now is open for comments, questions from the audience. I'm sure there will be questions and comments from the audience. Who wants to break the ice? Joss.
I knew it. I wasn't going to say anything.
I was hoping.
We were expecting you.
I was waiting.
No, we were waiting for you.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. It's been brilliant, by the way. It's lovely. Not only to see you and hear you all again, but just what you've been saying has been. So I've got a couple of things. Let me
just look what I have.
Oh, I recognize the cover.
Words in the way of truth.
Yeah. Oh boy, we're in trouble now.
That's activism for you.
Yes.
Yeah.
Something you know quite well.
Yeah. No. Anyway, no, I just wonder. To Paolo, I just want to remind, because I have a real boomer memory, and I can go further back in history than you. And you totally forgot the hippie culture, which was perhaps, I'm not sure if they were the first, but we thought we were, the sort of the whole green thing, I'm sure has developed from there. And but at first, you're right, I think, it was schifato and looked badly upon, because that's my own experience when I came over to Italy at first, and everything was very early left wing and everything, but then being a hippie was sort of irrelevant somehow. And so I'm curious about, also I didn't realize that it was actually a right wing thing, the early green. That surprised me, but I did have an experience where it was looked as not political, to talk about peace and love and the environment and all that, and living naturally and all that. And okay, so that's what struck me, apart from other things from what you said. And so just maybe you can have a look at what earlier things. And then I just have another quick comment. I always thought that descriptivism was activism. You know, that when you describe something, especially in our as academics, we're not just in an ivory tower, we're also teachers, or we were, you know, I was, you know what I mean? And with our students, just by describing, and you're unveiling, and you're inviting them to become aware, to take awareness, and you're hoping that this is going to, certainly you're active with them, and you're awakening their awareness. That's how I always felt it. And so all this, even now, you know, I think we have a huge responsibility with our students and with our children, you know, our families, anybody we come across, to explode all this, especially now with those of us who have children who are, or grandchildren in my case, who are really in danger with the platformed world now, you know. And then I thought that was brilliant, your breakdown and everything of all that. But I just felt that I always thought that there wasn't really a contradiction between descriptive work and active work, you know, but you have to make sure to do it, you know, to use the description, then what you're describing, of course, and how you describe it, you know, and how. So, you know, great, lovely. And so the active word, I liked a lot. I like the approach and the responsibility that we have. But as I say, I think as educators anyway, are in a privileged position to be able to actually do both, you know, so I wouldn't see them as against. Anyway, that's all. That's a couple of things that I couldn't stop myself from just mentioning.
We could always count on you, Joss. Thank you.
But please, somebody else. Okay. Anyway, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions or comments? Paolo, volevi dire qualcosa? Sorry.
No, just something on this left-right opposition about environmental issues. So actually, I was quite shocked, like you, to read some comments about the environment, but within the conservative areas in the 40s, in the 50s. So Churchill actually talked about the need to protect our big trees, right? So he was the environmentalist, right, at that time. And this was quite surprising because until the Great Smoke of London, until the 1951, I'm not sure about that, I don't remember the exact date, the environmental awareness and environmental consciousness, I would say, was just something that belonged to an elite, right? To an elite, so the protection of the countryside, the protection of the big trees, right? So until something happened, until some this was just something that was felt by few people.
Yeah. And if I can add something, I was thinking that the environmental issues have been affected at some point, at a certain point, by conspiracy theories as well.
Sure.
So that would be interesting to see how and if conspiracy theories have affected the narratives of environmental issues as well. And it has to do with left and right parties as well. So in the conflict between them, conspiracy theories work a lot in terms of narrative of this kind of issues.
Absolutely. The platformed world is full of denialist theories, that there is no climate change, and climate change is not anthropogenic. The platform world is full. So yeah, quite clearly, absolutely.
Both quantitatively and qualitatively, in the sense that it's not only just qualitative comments that are made. It's also combating things like the rise in temperatures, the 2.6 rise that is going to happen.
Scientific facts.
Scientific facts are being confuted. And so difficult to know which side, is true or is factual.
Yeah.
And how words are thrown back at you, like the woke. Woke is being used as a totally denigratorio, sort of thing. It's very sad.
Yeah.
Anyway, so you've got to.
We would need a whole other panel to talk about woke. A whole other panel.
Next year.
It's so controversial, so controversial.
Yeah.
Indeed.
Okay.
Can I add something to this last point that you've raised? Talking about you said, Maggie, you said the web is full of anti
Denialists.
people denialists, exactly, for climate change.
Yeah.
But not only that, I mean, we know in terms of hate speech and so on and so forth, how much is going on the web. Have you noticed in terms of analysts any big changes, if you could, measure them a little bit in terms of how much they've raised in numbers when after Trump and after the new waves of extreme rights movements? Have you noticed, because you have already worked on that for very long as analysts of that, have you noticed any big changes, like in a sort of a diagram and a pic? So when Trump speaks and says something, or, other extreme right politicians mention it a little bit more, negating, denying the existence of climate change or other things, have you noticed an an addition in terms of numbers of people denying, or new waves of new, trends rising?
Well, this brings back what we were talking about before. In order to approach what you just said, in order to have answers in terms of numbers, in terms of stats, okay, which is very difficult, extremely difficult, because as Paolo said earlier, I mean, we're still asking, what is hate speech? We're still asking that. We still don't know. There are so many manifestations of hate speech. It's multifaceted. So I don't personally have the answers. I don't think Bonnie does either. But in order to approach that problem, and in order to retrieve some statistics or data in terms of numbers to see whether, it's going down or it's going up in certain moments used by certain people, that's why we need small d investigation, because you need to tailor it. You need to target the context. You need to target the user. We need to target the phenomenon, and only then the various small d investigations could feed into the capital D, which is hate speech. I mean, I personally written a lot, published a book, but I cannot still answer your question. It's just, you can read a lot, you can be on social media from day to night, and you can witness all sorts of things happening, and you can feel it. You can actually feel whether it's going up or it's going.
Yeah, exactly.
But you can't put your finger on it, because the investigation in such large discourses need to be approached step by step in manageable chunks. Otherwise, you get lost, get totally lost. Totally lost.
Yeah.
That's all I have to say.
No,
Thank
and that's
you.
also.
I also appreciated what you said about being activist, as you all mentioned that. And I think this is a time in history that we all should be part of it. We should all be activists in our fields. I think this is the only thing that we can do, and raise awareness at a more higher level, if you want.
And that's also perhaps why certain communities, the ones not the Karen, obviously, that was a different take But the first two that they specifically need activist or active defense. And that's why we focused on certain communities that are particularly targeted by hate speech, very, very banally. Or in the case of incest victims, it's not so much hate speech, it's denial. It's strong denial, including what I said right at the beginning with the name, the way it's called. You know, it's not called incest, because incest obviously leads to certain thoughts and certain understandings of the questions. If you call it something else, then you make it something else. I mean, Giuseppe and I worked on fat, obesity, and that's also a field in which you play with names, you know. So what Maggie said is exactly, I think, where we're coming from. Basically, trying to focus, not because being descriptive, as Joss said, is not enough. Of course, that's brilliant. The fact, but maybe you can go a little bit beyond. Maybe you can focus on certain areas that are specifically targeted, and make people aware of it. That's all. Awareness raising.
I have an example. I mean, we've all heard of the new idea of having sex education in schools, right? Now, as researchers, if we don't become active, if we don't produce material, if we don't produce data, if we don't produce research that then can be fed as teaching materials in schools, who's going to do it? Who's going to do it? It's not enough, you know, just to ask teachers that they have to do this. You know, they have to teach hate speech, and they have to teach sex education. They have to teach all sorts of, on the side subjects. But as researchers, if we don't provide, you know, the material, if we don't provide the facts, the evidence, they'll never be able to do it. This is what we mean. I mean, and this is just the field of teaching and education, teacher training, actually. You know, there are other branches. We can branch out, you know, in all sorts of directions. But the first thing that comes to my mind is because just this morning on television, or yesterday, I was listening to the debate whether or not, you know, parents agreed or did not agree, if they had a right to intervene in the school curriculum or not. So all of this, you know, needs to be taken into account as researchers. So small d that feeds into the bigger discourses, such as sex education in schools, as a matter of fact.
And perhaps just to conclude, because otherwise we'll get our knuckles rapped by Giuseppe, and that is just to remember the PRIN project that he's just concluded, or that we've just concluded collectively, where, you know, tools to send into the schools, multimodal tools to send into the schools, so that kids become aware of what hate speech is, you know. So all this is what we refer to when we talk about some form of activist turn in CDA.
Yeah. I think that another good way, just to chain what you were saying, is to analyze and to promote love speech as well. Just not analyzing and avoiding hate speech, but being active, doing something positive, which is, I think, more influential than just identifying the sources of hate speech. A shift of focus is also considering another way of saying the same thing, but in an active way, in a positive way.
Absolutely.
To me, this is the aspect that I would like to include in future critical discourse analysis approach. And it is a conceptual shift, as you were saying. I totally agree. We have to keep at safe the methodological apparatus of CDA, but we can move on to a different conceptual idea of what power is, and to consider the positive aspects of performance of discourse, analyzing what help people to promote solidarity, collaboration, peer-to-peer relationships, and not subordination, power and subordination, but power among peers. So, okay,
That's-
let's identify, let's give voice to the marginalized, but let's help all the others to acquire tools to speak in a different way, to perform in a
Absolutely.
different way.
Absolutely.
This is what actually Maggie was saying about education, right? Education
Yeah.
is both, right? It's both hate speech, recognizing, being able to recognize hate speech, but being taught love speech, if you want. It's a different type of perspective, and so probably the two sides go together, the two things go
Yeah.
together. Right, so this is I was just wondering about something that Maggie said before. So yes, the capital D and the small d. Uh, my problem, or the problems that some students actually are facing these days, and I try to do my best to follow their works, their research projects, is that when you get data from, or take data or examples, or anything from the, let's call it, platform, right? So just to 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 include everything that is,
Mm.
how can you justify that this is going to be representative or not? So something that you take from a blog, something you take from another blog, something you take from a comment. Yes, this is true because it is there, it's on the platform, it's on the podcast, it's on, but uh, how can it be considered as representative? And so how can it be transferred from a small d to a capital D? Because you find everything and the opposite of everything on the platform. So for example, I just want to mention an experience that was quite recent. uh, I think that a student of mine had a very good idea to investigate the new types of humor, right?
Mm.
How humor has changed, right,
Mm.
in 20, 30 years, and the way new generations actually smile and laugh is completely different from ours. So from us, at least from mine. And he tried to investigate, all right, the word of memes, the word of some sort of course, he said, "Oh, come on, I'm taking these from this blog, from that blog. How can I justify that they represent the new way to laugh, the new humor today?" So this is sometimes my problem, and I don't know how you manage to probably the answer is to collect many examples. So it's a matter of quantity, or I don't know, because the reliability of the sources is always questioned.
I don't think it's so. I'm sorry. You wanted to answer that? Go ahead. Go ahead. Go ahead.
No, what came to mind very quickly, otherwise I'll forget it, is in the second case study we mentioned, which is Bad Love, which was the violence against women, where we managed to identify certain phraseological formulas. I mean, over a vast amount of material from Reddit. If you didn't do this, I would love you more. And certain, what we did there, I totally agree with what you're saying. I couldn't agree more with what you're saying. But what in fact happened there, or what we try to do, is you take a big D discourse, which already exists, which is violence against women. We know it exists. It's out there. We read about it every day. We watch it every day. We see it every day, etc. Then we go down and we build as big a corpus as we can, which is what Maggie and I did across Reddit, of women, battered women, as we would call them in English, describing their experiences of violent partners, violent husbands, etc., and then try and send that back out again. So you've got a sort of circular movement. Now, it's true. It's true that, I mean, however big a corpus you are, or a data set, in this case, you're putting together, it may not be effectively representative, but you are echoing something that does exist out there. So what you're doing, do you see? So there is a kind of circularity in what we did.
I see what you mean. I see what
That's
you mean. Okay. I get
No,
it.
also because if you want to contextualize what you just said, Paolo, how can I justify if this is represented or not? I do not think it's a matter of justifying anything. As you quite rightly said, you need to present as many specimen as possible. Now that could be representative of a phenomenon, but what I think is crucial is what's missing in schools, and that is having a critical eye, giving them critical tools to understand what they're looking at and not just passively absorb everything that they see, everything that they hear. And all you have to do, again, is watch the local news, and every single day we're being told of what's happening. Because students, we're talking about students right now, but are not capable of understanding what's going on.
Sure.
They pick, as we said in our talk, they pick up, they emulate, and they spread without having that critical eye on what's going on. So it's not justifying, not saying this is representative. No, this is what's going on, whether it's staged or not staged, whether it's authentic and not authentic, okay? This is what's going on. And what do you think? So as many examples as possible. That's how I would go about it. That's how I actually do go about it.
Thank you, because this is always a problem for me.
Yeah, it is. What isn't yet?
Okay.
Yeah, Maggie,
Okay.
just before the second, the exercise you suggested as well of
Yeah,
not only describing, but then actually with the Karen, I think
redoing
it was. That's a really brilliant way, I think, as well, of getting into
because
it.
they do it every day,
stop it.
every single day. They
that's
publish
really good.
reels. They just,
Yeah.
that could be one of the
Sorry.
ways.
So it's description with a twist,
With an oomph, with an umph.
With an oomph.
Yeah.
That's it. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I don't know if there are any other questions from the floor. No? No. Okay. So I think we can start concluding panel. I'm really, really happy for what has come out of this panel. So thank you, everyone. It's something that we can think about, because the kind of reorientation that we are thinking of, I hope, might represent a seed toward a paradigm shift in the way media relationships and social relationships are approached. So we can create a new trend, the fashionable word, new trends in critical discourse analysis, thanks to all these kind of reflections that have come out of this brilliant panel. I'm really happy to be the host of this panel. And this final seminar of the series coincides with the 10th anniversary of I-LanD, I-LanD creation. So long live I-LanD, I'm happy to say that at the end of this cycle. So we now eagerly look forward to the 5th series of the seminars, of course. So we're all here, and we'll see what happens. So in the meantime, thank you all again. Thanks, Syria. Thank Paolo. Thank Bonnie and Maggie. Sorry, I say Bonnie and Maggie now.
Thank you so much.
Finished.
Yes.
Thanks, Pasquale, for your hidden work. Thanks, Joss, for your presence. And
absolutely. Thank you. Thank you for inviting us. It was a pleasure to see everyone.
Yeah, yes,
thank you.
It was a real pleasure. Thank you to Mikaela, right? Because Mikaela was our host.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, and see you next year somehow, and see you elsewhere in the meantime. Okay.
Yes. Thank you very much. Bye.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you all. Thank you.
Thank you, Celia. Bye. Thank you, Ross. Bye.